Tom? Well, good evening. I'm Marcel Acosta, the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission. On behalf of NCPC, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the British Council, and the Trust for the National Mall, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Beyond Granite, Global Approaches to Public Art, Placemaking, and National Commemoration. This joint forum marks the final NCPC Speaker Series event for 2010 and features three preeminent individuals in the arts world, as well as my friend and colleague, Thomas Luebke, Secretary of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, who will moderate tonight's program. Before we start tonight's program, I'd just like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, please make sure that you turn off your mobile phones and electronic devices. A moderated discussion will follow the presentations, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions and answers from the audience. This program is also being broadcast live via the web, so please present your questions at either of the two microphones positioned at the aisles so our viewing audience can both hear your questions and answers from our panelists. Tonight we'll be exploring a topic of national and long-standing significance, that of commemoration in our nation's capital. As one of the federal agencies that reviews plans for national proposed memorials, NCPC is particularly interested in exploring new ideas regarding how our country's most historic figures and events are commemorated. For many Americans, early memorials bring to mind images of bronze statues with men on horses and historical phrases etched in granite. In more recent decades, memorials have evolved to much larger works located on multi-acre sites. But the way we commemorate can change yet again. During our March Speaker Series and in his book, Monument Wars, author and Professor Kirk Savage, who joins us in the audience tonight, sparked the idea of developing a series of temporary commemorative installations. So tonight we intend to build upon this concept by exploring how temporary displays may offer a compelling layer to the commemorative landscape of Washington, D.C. This could help alleviate pressure on the National Mall, prompt greater exploration of design and material, and perhaps even bring new people into the commemorative discussion. Imagine how many more stories might be told if we were to embrace the concept of temporary public art and placemaking. So each of our distinguished panelists brings extraordinary expertise to this topic, and our moderator, Tom Luebke, offers notable insight to the subject of commemoration in Washington. A graduate of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, Tom is a licensed architect with experience in planning and historic preservation in public and private sectors. He previously served as executive director of the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and since 2005 has served as secretary of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. CFA and NCPC have a very close working relationship, particularly in the area of commemoration, and in fact partnered together in the 2001 Memorials and Museums Master Plan and the 2009 Monumental Core Framework Plan. Both plans strongly support the exploration of alternative sites for future commemorative works in the nation's capital. So I'm delighted to have Tom join us for this evening's program, and I ask that you join me in giving a very warm welcome to our moderator, Tom Luebke. Thank you.
I think I'm on. Thank you very much, Marcel. Good evening to everyone, and thank you all for being here this evening. On behalf of the Commission of Fine Arts, I'm really honored to participate in the event tonight. And we also appreciate NCPC for organizing this compelling speaker series, focusing on an issue that touches everybody's idea of what it means to be a citizen of our country and of our city, public art and commemoration. Today we're going to look at several aspects of how our culture chooses to express its values within the public realm and how these ideas may be changing. So some of the questions maybe in the back of our minds that we're going to be raising this evening are, how is our culture changing? What does it mean for the expression of our collective memory? Is there a difference between spontaneous and state-sponsored commemoration? How do new technologies and artistic techniques inform this commemoration? Can commemoration be temporary as opposed to a historic idea of it being eternal? and how can commemoration as public art affect placemaking within our cities? So these are some of the questions we'd like to think about this evening, and we're joined by a wonderful group of artists, each of whom brings a very unique perspective to these important questions. And I'm going to mention right now, we've got on my right Krzysztof Wodiczko, an artist and professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design in Cambridge. On my left, Julian LaVerdiere, artist and production designer in New York, and Justine Simons, head of cultural policy for the Mayor of London. We'll be hearing from each one of these panelists individually prior to our group discussion, and so we will follow that with a question-answer period with the audience as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first guest, Krzysztof Wodiczko. As I mentioned, he's an artist, currently a professor at Harvard University, formerly at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, renowned throughout the world for using public buildings as monuments as backdrops for large-scale slide and video projections. By projecting the images, coupled with voiced testimonials, Krzysztof disrupts our traditional understanding of the functions of public space and architecture. Among his highly recognized works is The Veteran's Flame on Governor's Island in New York City. He's a recipient of the 1998 Hiroshima Prize for his contribution as an artist to world peace, and is also the recipient of the Skowhegan Medal for Sculpture, the Georgi Kepes Award, and the Gloria Artis Gold Medal for the Polish Ministry of Culture, among many others. His work has been the subject of numerous publications, including City of Refuge, a 9/11 memorial, and he's currently developing new public art projects in Poland and France. So please join me in welcoming Krzysztof Wodiczko.
So there is, when I hear the list of various awards, I feel a little bit myself like a very object of my work, the monument. But I must add one more, because it relates to what I will be presenting today. I also received a Hiroshima Prize, which was given to international artists for his or her contribution to the world peace. I did not deserve this. But since I accepted it, I keep working and will be working probably until the end of my life trying to deserve this prize. So immediately upon accepting this award, I started to work in that direction. And this was my projection on so-called A-bomb dome. That the image that you see here, which is a well-preserved ruin of the building that witnessed the bombing, because it was standing just under the hypercenter of explosion. That's why it survived, because all of the forces were vertical, and it's one of the few concrete buildings in Hiroshima of that time. So it does remember a lot, and it's preserved as a wounded witness. Well, start thinking about how to actually respond to this and how to make sense of this monument today. I started to work on kind of research, trying to find out what actually is impact of this explosion or this disaster, this bombing today. And it proved to be true that several generations of survivors are already there, meaning those who actually survived it, their children and their grandchildren, and maybe now great-grandchildren, because of the transmission of trauma through generations. So I thought that perhaps those people, those survivors, should be able to help with this project, and at the same time doing this, helping themselves in reanimating themselves and finding the words and expressions for unspeakable experiences in the process of animating this building. Because the building is a kind of silent witness, but also evidence of its own trauma. But those who survive are also living evidence of their own trauma. Survivors who are not speaking. So the issue is how to make them speaking, how to break the silence, and how to also reactualize this monument. So, taking advantage of this, I like to, first of all, show a few images of the projection itself. So, could not project directly on this monument because it would be almost a sacrilege. So I projected underneath in the surface, the embankment, just close to the mirror of the river. Creating a situation in which those who choose to be part of the project would imagine that they are actually as tall as the building, that they are the building themselves, fully conscious what's on the left side, what's on the right side, what's in front of them, and some of them could actually recall what the building was seeing during the bombing, or after the bombing, and some of them would refer to other events, perhaps see the city in which the war, the fallout of the war still continues behind the veil of privacy. Because, for example, the grandfather, an ex-imperial army officer, is turning entire family into boot camp without saying the word about his experience. So the war continues. Children don't know why he's acting this way. Grandchildren don't know how he's acting this way. The issue is how to start speaking about this rather than being silent. So one of the examples here I can show, showing a little bit of a document, video document. Have a sound, please. No sound. And the sound is important because of speech. The silence of the city. One of the objectives of this kind of work is to break the silence. The silence around, because it's important to not only hear what city is saying, but also what is not saying. So could we have a sound, please? That monuments actually are losing their impact and their importance if we are not doing much with them, or they cannot respond to the changing circumstances. They are being kind of closed into a kind of celebratory mood. To rescue the past, to save the past from wrested from conformity, which at every moment threatens to harm it. That should be one of the tasks of the historian, according to Walter Benjamin. The way in which the past is honored as heritage is more disastrous than its simple disappearance, said Benjamin. The historian who saves the moment, one or another, from the past, from conformity that threatens to harm it, must infuse it with new meaning in the light of his own present, and it does so because he feels responsible for the past. So this is maybe the motivation that Benjamin formulated for critical history. But we could say that artists who are working with monuments could also follow this kind of philosophical position. Reactualization of the past in present time. That's something that was behind this project. At the same time, those survivors who decided to take part in this project, they had to learn and develop in the process of so-called preparation for this project, they must have working very hard to develop their capacity to open up and share the most painful experiences, unspeakable lived through events. So this is an important part of this kind of monument animation, is one must animate oneself first in order to be able to become a monument animator. And the monument is important transitional, theatrical, para-theatrical situation that, that inspires people to actually work sometimes for as long as a year, recording and re-recording and trying to finally say something through the monument that is already saying something, but it could even say more. I'm sorry, we cannot have a sound here because everything here is about speech. It's about open speech, paresia, which is the very core of democratic process. And memory, that is an experience of critical experience that needs to be part of this open speech, First Amendment. We must be able to open up and share our own memories, even if they are contesting memories, if there is a kind of agonistic process in which memories are in conflict with each other. In this particular work, in order to create conditions for this, I invited those who were not even allowed to be commemorated in Peace Park, so-called Koreans. So it was an official event. Not very often I take part in official celebrations. Projection took place a day after the anniversary of bombing and another day afterwards. And I invited people who were relegated to the position of vanquished, as Benjamin would say. That is, whose memory was not even registered. Koreans who were slaves, Japanese slaves during the war, were bombed together with their masters. So so here Japanese became victorious, vanquished, while Koreans became vanquished. So to give them a voice in this project, equal voice, was definitely an important part of the project. And quite difficult for many people to hear, because here those so-called Koreans, Korean-Japanese, they were accusing, contesting, like this one here.
偉い役人が広島を訪れた時、私がなぜ朝鮮人被爆恐るべき熱戦で鉄も石も溶け、町のすべてが焼き尽くされたというのに、カタカナで3文字、漢字で2文字、差別だけは焼けなかったと見えて、差別は今も生き続けているのだ。
Here there is a person who visited State Department in Washington begging the United States government to do something towards nuclear disarmament. And person very shy, the one who actually survived bombing, Hibakusha, she decided to speak. Could we have a little stronger voice, please?
英語のできる人、スタッフの一人がついて国務省に行ったんですね。原爆を落としたことは絶対に間違いじゃなかったし、そのために早く戦争が終わって少なくとも
So he was trying to explain to her, to people who came from Hiroshima, that the bombing was
その時
justified,
私はただつい
and
てて
explaining in a very
黙って
kind of
聞い
logical way
てた
how
だ
many
けだった
lives
んで
were
すけど
saved because of the bombing. Here she came from the city that
兵
lost
隊の命が
200,000
兵隊の
people
命が救わ
in
れた
one
って言われた時、私は神の逆立つ思いをしたんです。だよ。絶対に語りたくなかったし、語ってると泣いてしまったりってそんなんがあったんですけど。
お互いに
沈んだ死骸を多くの人々が6日落ちた後
So she's
死骸を船
speaking
に積んで
about what she saw.
そして焼けてない
So
川
she's
上に
becoming the
持
building.
っていき
She consciously
亡くなった人々を
points her
山
finger
積みにして
to things that were happening as if she was as tall as
そ
the
してお
building.
骨にしたんですよ。
The
54年前
mortar,
の
the
人
bricks
々
of the
は
embankment are visible through the projection,
後ろから
which is very important because it prevents us from an attempt to identify with those people. There is something in between. There is a body of the building, the witness, the monument itself. But also it gives them a little more of a kind of
その人間がこの
protection
川の水面に
against too much of a confession.
死骸が浮いてたんです。
So the reason I'm bringing up this project is because I see how many buildings here and how many monuments, how many sculptural and architectural monuments are waiting to be reactualized, that they need to be alive again, to be useful for the living, to say something about what they see, what's happening in front of them and far away, maybe from their heights, what we don't see, at the outskirts of the city, in the pockets of the city. What it is, contradiction between the idealism in the name of which they were built and the actual conditions of life of people and their own experiences. How many things still needs to be done? How many things must be said so the tragic past will not repeat itself. So in this way, the monuments can be useful. This is the end of the projection. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Krzysztof, for that presentation, and it gets, I think, fairly quickly at the heart of some of these questions. How do we reactivate the past? Whose history are we commemorating, and how can we, what's the appropriate way for these objects of commemoration to be meaningful to across the generations? We're going to now talk to Julian LaVerdiere, an artist and production designer based in New York City. He's a graduate of the Yale Graduate School of Art, the Sculpture Program, and a founder of LaVerdiere Design Limited, producing print, public event, television, and film creations. Since 1998, Julian has exhibited his art publicly in numerous commercial galleries and museums, including the Andrew Krebs Gallery, the World Trade Center Studio Program, the Queens Museum of Art, the U.S. Library of Congress, and the United Nations General Assembly Hall. In September 2001, Julian and fellow artist Paul Mayota collaborated with a team of architects, public art organizations, and others to create Tribute in Light, an annual light memorial honoring the victims of the World Trade Center collapse. Another of Julian's creations, entitled Sentinel Lanterns, is now permanently installed at the Fire Department of New York Engine and Ladder Company 277-221. He is the recent recipient of the Cooper Union Urban Visionary Award and a recent inductee of the Cooper Union Alumni Hall of Fame for his contribution to the advancement of science and art. Please join me in welcoming Julian LaVerdiere. Stand by.
Thank you very much for having me, and I think that it's humbling to always be asked to speak on monuments because I feel far too young to be addressing anything so old. And I think I'll step back to how maybe I first found myself here and try to encapsulate that experience. So the thing that I've found curious about monuments and was often their anonymity. And I think that you could only aspire as an artist to be so grand as to build a sculpture like this, but can anybody actually name it? Do you actually know, what that sculpture represents and what it was meant to mean? And I think the point is that that meaning changes regularly. But as the artist, I sort of felt an affinity because you also are struggling for recognition. And I'm going to start briefly 10 years ago when I had more hair. And I was struggling for recognition, and I and a friend, Paul Miyota, here on the left, had been asked to make a proposal for a public art project. And we never thought there would be enough chance that we'd be selected, so we thought we'd set our task of making the most outlandish proposal that could be conceived, which was to create a beacon to be mounted on top of the radio mast of World Trade Center 1. And that beacon was a simple beacon. It was just going to emit the light from a single sea plankton. And it was going to sort of be a Horton Here's the Who type sculpture, where there's this tiny little creature that is inside this vessel that monitors its light and then amplifies it so the entire city could hear its voice. And perhaps it was somewhat of a metaphor for us. And in the process of proposing that, we actually were given a chance to try to execute it. And we were given a residency at the World Trade Center. This was through Creative Time and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And we had a studio on the 91st floor. So that's our beacon test up in that little window, flickering away. And we were sort of doing these tests to see if this would ever be visible. But I think we chose those buildings because they seemed impenetrable. And what we discovered was they were not. They were almost like a giant brain coral. And on the 91st floor, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council had taken over a quarter of this unrenovated floor and given it to artists' studios. And so we had a small studio that we set up sort of like a lab in which we were cultivating and growing this plankton and building these contraptions that would house it and having a good time. And it was a playful time. It was the spring of 2001, and we were setting up all these strategical maps of who could see our beacon and from where. And it was a really sort of joyous experience. That building was not at all impenetrable. It was filled, teeming with life of all forms. And so I guess that when September 11th occurred, that was, particularly devastating to everybody, but for us, in that it seemed like it struck exactly where we had been working. And I won't go into the recollections of 9/11 because we all have ours, but I will say that the things, as we were struggling in those first few days to kind of gain a conception of what had occurred, the thing that was absolutely ineffable was the cloud of smoke and light that was being emitted from the site. And that site was being illuminated by these recovery lights that had created a mist, a glowing mist, and you could sort of see in this slide how the beams would rise up between the buildings and create these shafts, and it felt as though there was a phantom limb sensation, if you will. Like, you know, there was something still standing there. And that's how we sort of began, you know, perceiving this sense of loss or shock. And we started sketching this idea out between Paul and I. And we had been asked by Creative Time, the public art organization that we'd been working for on our project, who in turn had been asked by the New York Times if there were any artists that would care to comment on what had happened. And how do you comment on what had happened when it had happened only a few days prior? I mean, the news cycle had to move forward. And so we took our sketches and we started envisioning this sense of this phantom limb sensation visually with Photoshop. And so these are Photoshop sketches. And we rendered this Photoshop rendering, and it was that which we submitted to the New York Times. And that image was put on the cover of the Times Magazine. And this all happened so fast. And I think this is one thing I wanted to stress as I talk about this project and the idea of memorials, is that this was never meant as a memorial. It was meant as a reaction, and because it wasn't as though there were something you could reflect upon. It was an immediate moment. And we actually had started thinking of this light tower structure as something that could be done to inspire the rescue effort. If there was, you know, if you can remember that, it only happened for a week while they thought there was still people to be rescued. But what had happened is once that image was out in the public domain on the cover of the New York Times Magazine and named Creative Time got flooded with public responses and flooded with people wondering if this is going to happen for real, and people loving it and hating it. And Creative Time didn't really know how to handle something like that. It became this entity almost overnight. So it was decided that we would try to create a structure like that which we drew. And they set up a website to field responses. And there was this interesting pie chart that was responses that had only occurred within a single month. And they really ran the gamut between, you know, people that were pro and con. And you can see that there were 143 responses concerned about birds. So it was a long way from getting this thing to actually, you know, conception to completion, or even off the ground. And Creative Time partnered with the Municipal Art Society and also 2 other architects that we had met in the process who had a very similar vision. And so we decided to share, you know, the plans and create, you know, a viable proposal. And we started rendering more images, where we tried to conceive of images that were more plausible of how it could actually look. And this was one that was then put on the cover of Art in America. And again, I'm showing these to you to sort of show you this really weird and accelerated process this was November. This is only 2 months after. So within 6 months from start to sort of the point at which it was finally to be approved and technically made plausible, it was decided by the city that it would be launched on the 6th month anniversary. So that became this new sub-memorial date, which would be March 13th. And at that point, it came to the question of, well before then, by December, it was where to place it. Because obviously, and I think most people don't realize this, you're not going to put it on ground zero. You're not going to get anywhere near ground zero, because ground zero is still a rubble pile that was, you know, 8 stories tall. So we were looking for locations within the immediate vicinity, and some of them were plausible, and some were, you know, very implausible. One proposal was to actually put it in the little bay that was to the west of the Winter Garden and have it floated on barges. And we sort of said that this is probably not a good idea because these things will move and the beams are going to, you know, cause seasickness. And there were other kind of interesting technical things that were sort of challenges. Was the scale, and immediately, obviously, we weren't going to construct a light tower that were going to be the same scale as the World Trade Center. So this was the final place where we chose to launch it first, and it was kitty corner across the street and north of the World Trade Center site. And we set up, we decided that they would be 1/16 the scale of the original buildings and slightly cocked. And what that means is we spun them so that they would always be visible as two beams instead of one overlapping beam, which was likely to happen if it was turned in the original configuration. That was the superimposition of the towers, or how you would see them as crossing one another's paths. So these computer renderings that John Bennett and Gustavo Bonivardi had rendered, they were the two architects that we were collaborating with, that were part of our Towers of Light initiative, had done these analyses. So this was Urban Data Solutions was good enough to lend us this model so that we could see it as a structure. And it's this is somewhat novel because 10 years ago this was a very, very exciting model. I think we're well familiar with computer models like this now. So, but it was for us it was really helpful to be able to see it from all over the city. And also those types of images were essential in getting approval. And I'm sure you all probably recognize how possible it is to get approval for most projects. So this was the site. And the site, I guess I wanted you to see it because you have piles of dirt, but you also have this crazy tent. And that's a giant decontamination tent that people would come in and go through and come out of to and from the work site. And there was trucks barreling down the West Side Highway and in and around it. So to be able to get anywhere near the site, we actually had to build our structures on top of giant scaffoldings that were almost land bridges that trucks could still pass beneath. So this scaffolding structure on the lower left was one of the two towers. And you can see that it's quite broad and it's about 50-foot square. And the spotlights themselves were very large. They were referred to as space cannons. This is the questionable brand name, but they're ganged up in a double row that ran the perimeter of the structure. And each of them were 8,000 watts. And another interesting thing about it is I think most people wouldn't realize is that, light beams shooting upward, what's the big deal? But actually getting them plumb and square and straight with one another was really tricky. And it started with the first beam. And so you'd have literally someone standing on a cell phone in Staten Island and in Jersey and Queens and Brooklyn, and you'd all look and say, yeah, it looks square from my position. And you tweak a little bit. And once you had one totally plumb, then you could set the others up accordingly. And because there was a lot of tweaking going on and it was a very sensitive time, we actually, there was a tricky thing, we projected them in this near ultraviolet, so they, when we were doing most of the rest of the beams, they wouldn't be visible to the public from a great distance. So that if you were down there on the site, you saw this curious purple thing going on, but from 20 blocks away, it started to fade. But it also was found that the best way to know these beams were aligned was to stand within them, which was one of the most spectacular views from the very center of these towers. So I thought I'd share that with you. And it was like looking up at a river of light. And until these towers were lit, it was all just a concept. It was like a sort of a dangerous bet as to whether or not it was going to work, but also whether or not it was going to appeal. And we were always concerned that this was going to be too garish, too bright, too vulgar, that it wasn't going to be respectful to the victims, and for whom we were erecting this, and also a sense of self. But that night when they lit, it was clear that all of a sudden, it was working. And there was a phenomenal effect that was hard to describe unless you saw it, was that they were just so tall, it was hard to even understand. Like all the drawings I'd ever made kind of ended at the top of the page. And these just never ended. And on a clear night, they would go, it was explained to me by physicists, they'd go to the atmosphere. So that's, I don't know, 25 miles or more. And they just felt like they were always leaning over you. And that was the interesting thing, is that no matter where you stood, you could be all the way across the bay, and it felt like they were leaning up and over you, because relatively speaking, whether you're in Jersey, Staten Island, or Manhattan, and you're looking up at the upper atmosphere, you're virtually all looking at the same point. So they were far more visible than we ever expected in more than one way, because until this point on that night of the 6-month anniversary, it was only ever meant to be a temporary art project. It was only ever meant to be something to inspire for the moment, as a as a moment of, of recovery. And on March 14th, or 13th, it was on the cover of every magazine. And that next morning when we got up and saw that it was on the paper of every paper above the fold, it was rather terrifying because all of a sudden it was no longer something that we were in control of. And I know that sounds odd, and it also probably sounds a bit vain to concern yourself with being in control of a monument, but there were so many times when we were worried about the spin of this thing, and there were weird requests that had been made of us as we had gone along. Like Giuliani, for instance, refused to let us erect it unless one beam was red and one beam was blue for the fire department and the police department. We said that it was not possible. You just can't project red and blue beams like that. And he said, well, then you can wait for Bloomberg. And we did. But these papers are all benign. The thing that was most terrifying was this, which started to happen, which was, and this is my last slide, so I'm going to close with this thought, but the artist creating an idea that goes out into the public domain that is vague enough as 2 light towers, that's up for grabs by anybody that looks at it. When a news organization like CNN, that's one that I generally respect, can publish a page like this on their website in which this thing gets listed under war against terror, I feel like maybe it's best if it were listed under war against remembrance. And these were the things that were our worst fears, where this thing could then become an arguing point for a war, and or worse, an icon for a war effort, which was something we never ever intended. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Julian. That was a fascinating discussion, but evolution of what was really a spontaneous expression of loss into something that has acquired a status as a memorial, and gets into some of this question of temporary memorial. And of course, the bigger question is, to what purpose is it used? So that's probably underneath everything that we're talking about. But our next guest is Justine Simons. She's the head of cultural policy for the Mayor of London. She oversees the mayor's cultural strategy on a wide range of projects, including London's film, fashion, music, theater, and international cultural exchange. She serves as the director of the mayor's flagship public art commission for the 4th Plinth in Trafalgar Square. Most recently, she has assumed the lead role for the cultural development of the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games in London. Justine currently serves as vice chair of the Thames Festival and is a member of several prestigious art and dance organizations. Prior to her work in the mayor's office, she worked in the field of contemporary dance as a producer and a director, and also as a consultant for the National Theatre and the Independent Theatre Council. In her role as director of the London 4th Plinth, she oversees this display of temporary art installations for the Plinth, which was built in 1841, but as a suite of 4. It was the 3rd featured sculptures, but the 4th never displayed a work until 1998, more than 150 years later. Please join me in welcoming Justine Simons.
Thank you. Cool. Let's get my presentation together. Okay, thank you for inviting me to my host today. I'm going to give a quick overview of the 4th Plinth project and also outline some of the themes and ideas that I thought might be interesting for you today. So the 4th Plinth sits in Trafalgar Square at the northwest corner. Trafalgar Square is the most prominent public square in the UK. About 40 million visitors go there every year. It was built originally to commemorate Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, built in 1805 by Charles Barry, the architect, who also designed the Houses of Parliament. The 4th Plinth looks up at Nelson and across at the Lions, and then down on the square, which is a site of cultural celebration. That's a picture of Chinese New Year that happens every year. This is another project that happened in Trafalgar Square, where we closed most of London and put an elephant through it. It's also a place for democracy and protest. There is a Burma protest. This is about Gaza. This is an old picture. The quote at the bottom says, struggle between police and the contingent in Clerkenwell. So that's a riot. So many demonstrations happen elsewhere in London, but they often culminate in Trafalgar Square. This is a demonstration by photographers whose rights were caught up in new laws about anti-terror. So consequently, there's a great deal of public ownership about that space, about Trafalgar Square. It's a space for debate. And the architecture reflects this. This is an aerial view, and you can see those two blue bits in the middle. They're the fountains. And they weren't actually put there to beautify the square. They were there as crowd management to stop lots of big crowds gathering and getting a bit unruly. And this is a picture of the fourth plinth on a typical British day. It's raining. So whatever we do on the fourth plinth generates quite a lot of debate. It's the People's Square. People really own that space. And also it's our most prominent kind of historical square. As you said, the fourth plinth was built in 1841. It was meant originally for an equestrian monument. And the idea was to raise the money for this by public subscription. But not enough money was ever raised, so it remained empty for about 150 years. Apart from a brief moment where they put up a statue of Edward Jenner, who invented immunisation, and it was so controversial in the day, the idea that you would give yourself a disease to solve the disease. People got quite freaked out, and there was a big campaign led by the clergy to take the statue down, so he was a goner. Lots of other campaigns. Diana, Shakespeare, Gandhi, Darwin, Dickens, and a peace dove. Lots and lots and lots of ideas of things people want on it. So around the millennium, the Royal Society for Art decided to try and get to the bottom of this question of what should be on the fourth plinth. And what they wanted to do was commission a series of temporary artworks, contemporary works, to try and resolve this question of the long-term future of this space. So they commissioned 3 artists. The first was Mark Wallinger, and his piece is called Ecce Homo. And that's Latin for Behold the Man. It's a life-size depiction of Christ. So it's kind of quite tiny on this huge plinth. And it's interpreted by lots of people as being about human delusions of grandeur. In the background you can see the church, that's St Martin's in the Fields Church. And the vicar absolutely loved this piece, so he became a brilliant advocate for the project. Next, they invited Bill Woodrow to do this piece. His piece is called Regardless of History. It's a big bronze piece, and it's a tree on top of a book, on top of a head. And he's interested in themes about man's destruction of the planet. Regardless of what knowledge we have, we still proceed to destroy this planet. Then Rachel Whiteread, she cast the plinth in transparent resin and then inverted it on top of the original. And she talked about it being a quiet pause in the square, a place for contemplation. The square is so busy that she was quite interested in that contemplative space. So the programme was quite successful, and the government, as is their way, decided they needed a report. So they commissioned Sir John Mortimer to write a report on what this meant and what might be the future. So he had lots of meetings, and the conclusion was that, yes, we like this idea of contemporary art. 30 pages later. And then another thing happened in London, which is we restructured the way we organise ourselves in government, and an Act of Parliament was passed to create a new mayor for London in 2000, and part of the new mayor's job was to take responsibility for Trafalgar Square, and my job was to run the culture programme, so the art bit dropped onto my desk and became the Fourth Plinth Commission. So far we've commissioned 4 artists. We've generated arguments about beauty and heroism with Mark Quinn's Alison Lapper Pregnant, which was an interesting start to the project. It drew out prejudice as well as positivity. It's a portrait of Alison Lapper, who's a disabled artist, when she was 8 months pregnant. It's carved out of a single block of Italian marble, and that's me and Mark Quinn in Piacenza when it was nearly finished. Weighs 13 tons. And really this piece challenges assumptions of who should be the subject of a memorial. This is a picture of the piece in situ. In the words of the artist, he talked about it speaking to the future rather than the past by celebrating the living. And Alison Lapper herself was a really brave and incredible woman. She had fought many battles as a disabled woman and as a mother to keep her child. So he was interested in the personal heroism of an individual as opposed to the heroism of someone who'd fought a large battle. And this I thought is interesting. It's just a sentence I took out of a review about Mark Wallinger's piece, actually, by Adrian Searle, who said, but we must remember the figure is only half the work. It is the figure in the setting that counts, and the way it becomes a lightning conductor to argument, debate, feelings. So one aspect is the way in which the context can alter the meaning of the work. And this here is a picture of Thomas Schuster. He's a German artist. And this is quite a good example of how the context alters the meaning, because the original title of the work was Hotel for the Birds. And he called it that because on one hand, he was building an architectural model of a hotel, which is very in sync with a long kind of set of works he'd been doing of architectural models. And he added the phrase for the birds to refer to the temporary nature of the sculpture, which makes absolute sense. Unless you're the Mayor of London and you've spent a whole year trying to rid Trafalgar Square of pigeons. You know, the Mayor's got, you know, we've got a hawk in the square, we've got bells, we've got, you know, lots of cleaning going on. It's on the front page of the papers all the time. There's a whole pigeon lobby trying to save the pigeons. And so the artist inadvertently found himself propelled into this kind of madness. And you know, people were saying, well, why is the Mayor wanting to, he makes all this play about removing pigeons, and then he goes and builds a hotel for them. So in the end, the artist changed the title of the piece from model for a hotel, which still describes what it is, but it takes it out of that political hot potato. I think one of the other things about the project is it really seems to have kind of entered the public's consciousness. And this was really demonstrated when we commissioned recently Anthony Gormley to do a work on the plinth. He asked the public to say what they wanted to do on the plinth, and so he organised over 100 days, 2,400 slots, and you could apply to have a slot on the plinth and do whatever you wanted as long as it was legal. And 35,000 people applied, and 2,400 were successful, and it was really popular. They got the name Plinthers, and Plinthers is now in the English Oxford Dictionary as an actual term. It made it into the storyline of The Archers, which is the longest running serial on radio. 9 million web hits, people watching it, streaming it, quite boring through the night. And I think really this one stretched the possibilities, both conceptually and logistically, of what is possible on that plinth. Anthony always talked about it being a portrait of the nation. He was interested in, you know, what is this moment in time? What does Britain look like in this year? So pushing this idea of public art to its absolute limit. The public are the art. That's a picture of someone dancing on the plinth. And one of the other things I really like about the project is the way in which the artists draw new meaning out of the context on the plinth and out of the square. And Yinka Shonabari is a British artist, and this piece is up there at the moment, and it's Nelson's ship in a bottle, Nelson being on top of the column, and it is an exact replica of his ship except for one thing, which is the sails are made out of African fabrics. And what Yinka is interested in is an alternative view of colonialism. We Brits are quite embarrassed about our colonial history, and Yinka's view is that it's not all bad, and actually one of the positive and perhaps unintended consequences of colonialism was that we've ended up in London with this incredible multicultural and diverse and international city. It's the most international place on the planet. It's 300 languages spoken every day. And this was kind of unintended, but a kind of really brilliant outcome of that history. I think another thing that is really at the heart of the project is the public conversation around it. It really captures people's imaginations. We always have an exhibition of maquettes of all the ideas. We have comments in the gallery and online. For this last round, I think so far we've had 16,000 comments on the proposals. We've got a schools programme, the 4th Plinth Schools Awards, so kids all around London propose what they think should be on it. We're in process with that at the moment. So far 90 schools have signed up for it. And they come up with amazing, profound things. It's really fantastic. And I think it's a very accessible programme. We've taken these really big, bold, contemporary ideas out of a formal closed gallery space and into the public realm. It gets it away from that formal gallery space with all its psychological and social barriers. But I think more than that, it has generated quite a big debate about the nature and place of public sculpture. Who is it in the 21st century we should be commemorating? Are we looking to traditional figures in stone or bronze? And we would argue no. I think originally, apart from not raising enough money to put an equestrian monument on the plinth, another big factor as to why it remained empty for so long was that no one could agree. And there was no consensus about who we should be commemorating. And these days, it's inconceivable that you would have consensus over a military figure in London today. There's lots of disquiet about Afghanistan, about Iraq. There would be no consensus on a military figure at the moment. So the contemporary intervention really kind of refreshes and wakes up the landscape, I think. I think, as you mentioned, many historical figures, they just seem to kind of fade into the background a lot. This is the 4th plinth. There's 3 other plinths with a king and 2 generals on them, and no one can name them. They just kind of disappeared into the background. So the rotating programme means that, in some way it means that kind of permanence is established in memory as opposed to bricks and mortar. And now, of course, another consequence of really getting it out there and lots of people talking about it is that every week someone's got a new idea for it. So we're besieged by different ideas and PR campaigns and new heroes to be on that plinth every week. And a few years ago, I don't know if there's one in the States, but there's a place called Madame Tussauds, which they do waxworks of famous people. And they phoned up and said, we'd really like to put this new waxwork of David Beckham on the 4th plinth. And I said, I'm really sorry, it's a space for contemporary art, and we have a commissioning group, and it's in train, and I'm terribly sorry, it won't be possible. But they just drove up there and did it anyway. And then we had to run out and take it down again. So I wanted to touch briefly on this question of risk and reputation. One of the advantages of the programme is that it's temporary. So if you don't like it, it'll be gone soon. So people take comfort in that. I think there's less anxiety about a temporary programme, which leaves us freer to experiment and test the boundaries a bit. Another issue around risk is political risk and interference. We've been quite keen to separate the programme from politicians, so they're not involved at all. And we have a commissioning group full of experts, and they kind of guide and oversee the programme, which I think is very important for artists, and it retains the kind of credibility and artistic integrity of the programme. And they know that when they sign up for it and they propose a work, it's free of political intervention. Oops. There we go. I wanted to also say that the programme sits within the city's broader vision to promote London as a world-class cultural capital. London is known a lot for its heritage. We're really fortunate in having 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But we've also got this really vibrant, big creative scene going on. The Tate Gallery is the most visited gallery in the world. I think 5 million people went last year. So it's really a popular, big part of our identity. So I think balancing the historical and the contemporary in the public realm is absolutely right. And then just to end, I thought I'd just quickly run through the current submissions that we're considering for the next commission. This is an artist called Hugh Locke. His piece is called Secanda, and he was interested in returning the equestrian monument back to the plinth because that was the original idea. But in Hugh Locke style, he covered it in treasure and medals as his own take on that. Elm Green and Dragset, Powerless Structures. They're looking at a kind of alternative to the traditional war monument, which typically focuses on victory or defeat. So the child is this kind of hopeful symbol, full of expectation. This is Katharina Fritsch, Cock. This would be bonkers if we did this. It'd be this real ultramarine, surreal thing in the square. This is another one where the context changes the meaning because, it's this big kind of historical space. Blue is the colour of the new government in the UK, the Conservative Party, and obviously cock has another meaning that isn't just about being a rooster. This has been interpreted politically in a different way. This is Brian Griffiths. His piece is called Battenberg. Battenberg is actually a cake, and we Brits, we love tea, so this is a celebration of tea times past, in his own words. And the Battenberg, it was a commemorative cake that was invented for Queen Victoria's granddaughter when she married the Prince of Battenberg. And he's made it out of Victorian brick, which was the era when lots of the statues were developed in the square. Marielle Neudecker, she wants to put a mountain range in the square, bringing landscape back into the city. And she's exploring this different idea of conquest, the idea that people always want to climb mountains and climb the kind of landscape. So conquest and permanence of a different type is one of her ideas. And then finally, Alora and Calzadir, ATM at pipe organ. The little dot there is an ATM. I have no idea how I will put an ATM into a Grade 1 listed monument yet. And the idea is that you use the ATM, and when you use it, you hear the church organ. So, bringing some much-needed joy back into the banking process. So that's it. So if you go online, tell us what you think. It's all live at the moment. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justine. It was I think a pretty good exposition of how we might be able to expand our definitions of commemoration and with a wider range of contemporary themes. And of course, about speaking to the future, maybe rather than the past. Of course, the argument may be that commemoration is always about speaking to the future. So these have been some very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I think we'll begin now with an open discussion with the panelists, talk about some of these ideas. So we'll follow up with some questions from the audience for the panels. And when we do start with that part of it and take questions, please make sure that you're speaking to the microphones. And I believe there's 2, maybe 3 here in the audience. And we want to make sure that you're speaking into them. This event is being streamed live, and we want to make sure that anybody watching the event on internet can hear the entire program. So to start, of course, in the context of Washington, it's a very complex process here, governed by a lot of federal and local laws, and our approach tends to deal with memorials as kind of a real estate development. So this is very refreshing to see a different take. Current examples of memorials that are under development right now include the Martin Luther King National Memorial, the President Eisenhower Memorial. Both of these are projects that take up many acres of land in the monumental core. As Marcel Acosta mentioned, older and historic examples of commemoration include in our city many circles and squares of the L'Enfant city featuring equestrian statues of military leaders from other eras. So as we discuss these opportunities in the future, what is, our central question is, what should these monuments be in the future? How can we speak about the past for the future? I'd like to start our discussion with a quote from the Austrian writer Robert Musil, who said that there is nothing in this world as invisible as a monument. And talking about all their commemorative rhetoric, memorials and monuments often have a very relatively short lifespan before their relevance diminishes and they become recognized as a mere landmark or ornamentation. So I'd like to ask, do you agree with Musil? Are monuments doomed to be invisible? If not, why no? Or if so, how might we shape them that they resonate and remain relevant to future generations? Krzysztof, maybe we could start with you on this subject of...
Now, I've been observing those monuments. In fact, somebody said, speaking of my old country, Poland, that somewhere between memorials there is Poland. So, of course, my feeling is that they are not necessarily what Alois Riegel said, homeless of history all the time, abandoned by interest and feeling irrelevant. Time to time, we are actually reviving them. We are sitting on their shoulders. We always assemble in front of them. We want to be seen by them because they've seen other things before. So why not seeing us? We are actually treating them as suspects and witnesses. So, but also sometimes they're completely in dark. Now lights are switched off and as if they were not there. So, for example, the monument to Franco in Madrid is completely dark. It's one of the biggest monuments, Arco del Triunfo. But during the first Persian War, when Spanish Armada was sent against popular hopes, suddenly this monument became a place for protests. Of course, I participated in this because I projected something that reactualized in relation to civil war, the memory of losses of civilians, which still live through in Spain. So there is a possibility to revive them. They are being revived by popular events, by marches, demonstrations, but also they're being revived by state performances that connect them with various parades, but also they could be revived by us, artists, the various type of media artists, performance artists. So the question is also how much we can help them to be alive between those historical events that animate them.
So what you're saying, I guess, is that there is new life for old memorials. I guess the question is, as we plan contemporary memorials, where do we take that idea? Julian, what do you think? Does the idea of bringing ephemera or temporary work to the fore change the experience for the viewers in a way that's different from a more old-fashioned, permanent commemorative installation?
I guess I think that the principal boredom is with figurative monuments. Period. I mean, they will always fade from memory, and people will grow tired of that individual or forget what they ever meant. Although I do like the Beckham. That was really good. You got to just steal it. However, maybe it's more about an experience that one can create through future monuments. I think that the monuments that I find most interesting are the ones that you can actually have a transformative experience by visiting. Brian Toll, for instance, did a potato famine memorial in Lower Manhattan. It's like potato famine. Not the first thing I think of, and I'm not making light of a famine, but how do you bring that to someone's attention, or how do you make them feel that? And what he did is sort of picked up an acre of Irish farm that had gone fallow and just sort of dropped it right onto the site. And that was kind of interesting because you're actually immersed in it, in the memory. But other than that, I think that one of the principal problems with memorials is their immobility. And obviously, I would argue for ephemeral memorials. I was involved with one that became such. But like 4th of July, it's an ephemeral memorial. It happens once a year. If you had fireworks every night, you get bored of them. But once a year, that's pretty fun. I'm still not really sure what the 4th of July was about, though.
Time to check your history.
It's about fireworks, right? It's getting drunk.
Well, well, that's it. It's interesting. I think fundamentally, I think it is about I think you mentioned this transformative experience is probably at the core what you're trying to create in a collective experience. Well, and immobility, going back to, which I think is linked to this Musil's comment about the invisibility of traditional memorials. And I think a question I'd like to ask is how do they contribute to experience in the city? There's something potentially comforting, or maybe it's ominous, about having a Civil War general. I mean, remember that this was a country at war, city under siege. This is something that very few people remember. But what is it? Is it comforting? Is it good? Is it bad? Overlooking your urban square, it becomes part of the urban landscape. But what are the opportunities for placemaking in the city when you actually have temporary installations? What does that do? And I think, Justine, that's a question for you and what it's done in London. Yeah.
I think it is a very difficult question. How you keep statues relevant? Can you hear me now?
I think they just had to.
Better? I was saying I think it is a really challenging question about how you make statues relevant and stop them from fading into the background. What we usually get is a massive campaign for a particular person to be commemorated, and then the statue goes up, and then quite quickly it's forgotten about, the job's done, that's it. I think one of the things that we've done with the temporary programme is generated a public conversation around it, and I think that is really important in keeping ideas and commemoration relevant and alive in people's minds. So the Schools Award, even Yinka's piece, The Ship in the Bottle, we did a big education project around that. He went into schools, and all of those kids are learning about the Battle of Trafalgar, about Nelson. They've all gone into Trafalgar Square, but they don't understand the kind of history of it. And so, in a way, it's brought that history back to life through a different door, really. So I think it's done that. It's kept the conversation alive. And as I said, the temporary nature of it just kind of wakes up the landscape. It makes you look at the piece and what it means in its context afresh.
Well, I think we're talking then about, again, this, I think, a quality of temporality, of change. And I think it's probably important to understand that there's a difference between a remembrance and a commemorative work, and for example, the laying of flowers at a gravesite or lighting of a candle, which is something that happens maybe periodically. It's a gesture of reverence. I think that we probably need to think about our concept of commemoration, that whether it implies sponsorship or support by a government or a larger political group, and whether that idea of remembrance can be linked or are they mutually exclusive. Krzysztof, the question, do we ask too much of our commemorative works, that we expect a permanent object to hold and embody something that is emotionally or politically significant for many people, for generations to come?
Talking about, I'm not against permanent memorial as long as it changes. I think it has to be responsive to changing circumstances and carry on certain kind of mission. Memorial has something to do, the word, with memento and with moneo, which means warning. Mind, remind. Be aware and keep in mind that something might happen again. So, for example, Second World War could be another war, could be another catastrophe. So what it is that we should do so it will not happen again? So the question is already somehow in the air. But could we actually think of memorials as working places, as a kind of possibility to engage people, younger people especially, in connecting with others and do something towards, well, the end of abolition of war, for example. We're talking about war memorials. Should they not become enhanced or become some kind of institutes for the abolition of war? I'm talking about memorial arches.
How would you get funding?
Arc de Triomphe. Arc de Triomphe, that's what I'm suggesting. For example, the one in Paris, which is the model for many other arcs, should become the World Institute for the Abolition of War, rather than the place that is cherished by visitors, by tourists, who are extremely impressed by its iconography and its glory, but in fact it's all about giving your life to some kind of new Napoleon who will stage a bloody world war, total war in fact. So why not submerged or build over those monuments something else that will be still in contact with the old memorial as something to study, to deconstruct, in order to construct a better world. This is my vision, of course. Utopia, I guess. But you ask, so I try to.
I think and of course the question is the monument itself, an existing historic monument in itself, in all of its idiosyncrasies of form and the words that are on it, et cetera, is that neutral enough? I mean, I think one of the successes of the fourth plinth is its neutrality of presenting basically a frame for this.
Can I just chip in?
Sure.
Interestingly,
Absolutely.
I talked about the schools awards. Big themes often emerge, and the biggest theme that emerges with ideas the kids want to put on the plinth are peace-themed monuments. Always, world peace, saving the environment.
But peace
It's all
cannot
about
be
peace,
made
anti-bullying,
by
making
being
peace.
peaceful. You cannot make peace by being peaceful. So it has to be more of a discursive project, I guess.
But again, it's a fascinating thing where, in the case of the Franco Memorial, you cite that a war memorial or a monument to the victor of the Spanish Revolution would then be repurposed as an anti-war monument. In the same way, interesting with the tribute in light, it was almost an inversion of something that came out. It started to be just a simple act of remembrance, and was actually appropriated for a different purpose.
As the war terminology was brewing after it had gone up, it made us examine how it had functioned and how you could try to interpret that. And there was this term that was floating. It was a book called Asymmetrical Warfare that was kind of fascinating to me, where it talked about how to strategize a war of asymmetrical warfare, where somebody's in a tank and somebody's got a rock. That's asymmetrical warfare. But we seem to be fighting an asymmetrical war that it's not going very well. And so I think that that monument functioned like an act of asymmetrical warfare, in which it was a lesser power trying to fight a greater war effort with a simple device, which was light and the media.
Right. Did one question I wanted to ask? We're going to open this to the audience, but I wanted to just follow up. Was it a surprise that the public's emotional attachment was that a surprise for you? And
it was totally shocking, and I just I think I want to reiterate that I was just a member of the public at this by the time it was lit. So it was the idea of authorship or oh, my project did this. It was much more like, wow, look what's happened. Mm-hmm. And there was a radical change overnight when we lit that for the first time, because Diller and Scafidia, who you may know, architects, they had done a project which was a sort of a gangplank, if you will, that would sort of craned over the pit, and people would come by the thousands to make pilgrimage to Ground Zero and look at the hole and the developing clearing and the maybe the excavation of what might become eventually foundations. And it was so grim and morose because it's almost like looking at an open grave. And so this project almost did the exact opposite, where all of a sudden people, instead of filing down to Ground Zero to look into the hole, were coming down to look straight up and try to find its zenith. And that was sort of...
I think it's an inversion, and one that traditional memorials always did appeal to maybe a higher purpose or a...
But I don't know,
the
worry is what did someone find from it? Was it a sense of awe, or was it like a call to arms? Which actually, the name of that sculpture on top of the Capitol building, it's actually Armed Freedom. Kind of spooky.
Well, let's...
Armed Liberty?
Armed Liberty.
Let's
Let's take some questions from the audience. I can barely see you, so I don't know how we can recognize these people. Yeah, I think we got some lights. Beginning with we'll be asking if you want to make a question, we'll ask you to take it into the microphone, starting with the gentleman over here on the left.
I just wanted to ask Justine to talk a little bit about the immediate political context in which this was conceived, because it seems to be a very playful concept and very post-colonial for Britain to look at things this way in Trafalgar Square.
So you want me to,
You have to speak
What's the political context that allowed...
What's the political context that allowed this to happen? Is the question, what's the political context that allowed it to happen?
Yes.
Okay. There was there's been kind of 50 years of soul searching about this site, really. So lots of different political administrations, and the report written by John Mortimer captures a lot of that. And in the end, I think what Chris Smith did, he was the Secretary of State at the time, is he delegated it out to this committee to capture all of those conversations and take a proper look at what might happen in the future. And there was just tons and tons of proposals, of campaigns. And I think it was his vision, really. It was his vision to kind of hand it over to a group to pull this sense of what it might be together. So it was the Labour government who after these years and years of argument and contention, went, okay, let's have a go at this. Let's try and solve it. Let's try and build some consensus. There wasn't any, and the idea was to continue with this temporary idea. So I don't know whether it would have happened under a Conservative government. I'm not sure. However, it's interesting for me because I've worked for two mayors, one Labour and one Conservative, and I did wonder when there was a transition whether the new mayor would want to pick it up, because in his election campaign he'd made some statements about different military figures, and when he arrived I had a kind of emergency meeting with him to describe the programme and basically persuaded him it was a good idea, and fortunately I persuaded him, and he decided to keep the programme. And I think now it's moved over two political administrations, it's in a safer place, and the public so identify it, and so it's so part of the landscape now after the Anthony Gormley piece where 9 million people hit the website and commented on it and watched it. It's kind of in the fabric of the society now, so...
And it sounds like it becomes something that people will look forward to seeing what the next...
Yeah, they do, yeah, what's going to be on it next. Even the press commentary has changed. When we first started it, it was a bit reactionary. It was a bit, oh, well, what about military figures? And now the reporting is much straighter. It's much, these are the 6 ideas, this is what they're exploring, and people do tend to just look forward to what's next.
Next question over here on the right.
I think it's been touched on a little bit, the idea of experiential monuments or memorials, and I think one of the issues is that memorials are often singular in focus, and so I think more of landscape projects in Battery Park City. There's a project that talks about the history of Manhattan and sort of what was there before people inhabited it, and they have bird sounds and they have ice walls and different aspects, but they're also playgrounds and, not in this case, but in other cases, ice skating rinks. And I think there's a way that to enliven memorials with other activities besides just the figure or the war in which it's commemorated.
I agree. I actually, when we were preparing for this, I think Lucy had asked me what I thought of various memorial proposals. She said there was something about a World War I memorial, not a memorial, but maybe a big anniversary coming up. But I thought, what better way to memorialize it than to dig up the mall and recreate trench warfare. And then people can come and visit it, and they can clomp around the mud and maybe just fill it with blood, barbed wire, and that would do it.
Make another war.
Yeah, well, that would definitely give somebody something to think about.
It's an opportunity for turf reconstruction, too. Yeah.
And a lot of work. There would be a lot of jobs offered by digging up this trench.
Can I chip in? Yeah, I agree. I think that temporary and ephemeral work can sometimes be much more powerful than fixed pieces. And the piece I showed, which wasn't a piece of public art, but the Elephant Project in London, really temporary piece, sprung on Londoners over a weekend. Really, it's one of those things where, it lives in memory and not in mortar. And it was an extraordinary moment of Londoners coming together, because it wasn't very long after we'd had bombings in London. And lots of the commentary was about people saying, this is the first time I've left the house, I've gone into town. It had a whole new meaning, which was Londoners coming together and reclaiming the streets after that terrible bombing. And it really lives in people's memories, and YouTube, and everyone's got a personal story about it. And it was a completely temporary thing. It happened and it's gone.
Another question over here.
Yes, thank you for your work. Quick question. I'm just curious if you have a sense of what the digital age has done to our cultural memory, enhanced it, or made it more evanescent?
Me.
I don't know.
Anyhow.
Who'd like?
I think that there's an enormous amount of memorials and monuments in digital space. In fact, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, many people are living monuments to their own trauma, meaning the memory of overwhelming experiences they need to be transmitted, since the memory is also an act of telling a story. So the electronic space, the communication space, seem to be extremely suitable for a new kind of memorial. The question is, how can we connect this kind of discourse with physical and stable symbolic structures or events that are taking place in our physical environment as well? Because only the relation between those two somehow makes our city as a communicative environment, the mouthpiece of the people, the city itself. So I think the possibility of making link between events, physical symbolic structures, and communication networks, and that might be a very good idea.
So enhancing.
Something that was kind of interesting about social networking sites and a digital space, and I'd read something in the paper last month about how kids, 14-year-old kids now, they're like putting naked pictures of themselves on the internet, don't realize that it's gonna be there ad memoriam, and the only way to forget this is to change your name. So you will have memorials to your youth as you grow up.
Yes, sir. Next.
Yeah, I'm Richard Westbrook. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees for the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. We have just endorsed the National Park Service's plan for the National Mall, which NCPC, National Capital Planning Commission, just approved Thursday. One of the things we have to do now is how to implement that plan. And we were thinking of maybe have one of those pavilions that they want for visitor centers in commemoration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and have it on Constitution Gardens, which that act reflect the expansion of freedoms under our Constitution for people with disabilities, And we have millions and millions of people, citizens of this country, with disabilities. The pavilion would be what is planned there. It's a visitor center with multi-purpose ideas, things to do, one of which is you would make it so it would be obvious to the people without disabilities that you have to do certain things so that people with disabilities can appreciate and learn and use the facility. Your imagination can go on and on about how to do that, but you have to emphasize what it takes to really do this. And the commemoration, some of you may know that it's now 20 years old, the act. There was all kinds of people involved with it. Ted Kennedy, Harkin of Iowa, and a local guy named Justin Dart, who lived in Southwest, is now deceased. But it was a mammoth effort to get that act passed and now to implement it. So that would be, what do you all think of having such a facility in commemoration of the advances under our Constitution for all U.S. citizens? I'd like your response, please.
So,
Surveyors in every metro stop illustrate that.
The comment being that the act has required the installation of barrier-free pieces in our whole public infrastructure. But I think the larger point is this a good idea? I think the bigger issue is there is a possibility for interaction, for dealing, themes that are in our current daily lives could be certainly commemorated in a way that wasn't imagined under a more traditional way of conceiving of commemoration. I think that's one of the successes, Justine, of your program in London. Do we have, I think we may, do you have another question over here? I think this would probably be our last question for the evening, and we'd love to hear from you, sir.
So what do you think about the idea that memorials should have a 100-year lifespan, and then after that they have to be renewed by the living? Instead of, here in DC we have a lot of memorials to people. I mean, I care about the Civil War ones, but I wouldn't have a clue about the War of 1812 guys. Should they be temporary? 100-year and then 50-year renewals?
maybe you just rename them.
It's hard to do when they have statues sitting there.
Actually, I was fascinated with, just like those teenagers. They were doing this, it was popular in the 1880s to collect obelisks, and all three superpowers, London, France, and America, all went to Egypt and pilfered all these big obelisks and then brought them home and named them after the people that paid for the pilfering.
There's an important example of this kind of thinking, is by Robert Filliou, who proposed a program of exchange of monuments. In neighboring, like for example, neighboring countries will exchange their war memorial.
What if your monument's not threatening anymore? Like Lenin doesn't really get much on the market anymore.
Yeah. Well, the question, I think that the open question here is a temporary. I mean, is a temporary memorial a good memorial? I mean, is that what?
I think as long as it evokes memory.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be room for both, to be honest. I think, you might not care about 1841, but we wouldn't want people just to forget it ever existed. So I think there's room for both. I like the idea of a 100-year lease.
Well, I think it's important to remember that we do, without taking a poll here, I think there probably are traditional stone and mortar kind of memorials that people still find extremely moving. I know I have my list of things that I still find incredibly important, yet the question is, where can we move? Because there's clearly a wider range of issues. And I appreciate you. I think your comments tonight have been really wonderful. Great questions from the audience, and we look forward. We appreciate your interest. The future of commemoration in Washington is a topic that obviously a lot of people are interested in, and we're going to be continue to work with our partners in the agencies, the District of Columbia government, as well as nonprofit organizations and citizens in continuing the discussion. We are looking right now, some of the groups that we work with, NCPC in particular, looking at the possibility of a pilot project to explore temporary commemoration here in Washington, one that might be, enable more active engagement with the daily life and the daily issues that are in the city. So I'd like to thank very much the members of our panel for coming and participating tonight. Justine Simons, Julian LaVerdiere, and Krzysztof Wodiczko. Your presentations have really stimulated ideas about how we might approach public commemoration in the city. And I'd also like to thank the National Capital Planning Commission for organizing this outstanding series and for the sponsoring partners who made the evening possible, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the British Council, and the Trust for the National Mall. Thank you all for coming this evening, and if you're interested in seeing a recording of the program, you will be able to find a video archive of the event on your partnering agencies' websites. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing where commemoration goes in the future. So thanks very much.